In the high mountain country of an old kingdom, where the long ridges of the spine of the continent fall into deep valleys that the rains and the winds have carved across many thousands of years, there is a single mountain pass that has been used by the people of the lower country since before the records of the kingdom began. The pass is called Eldhollow Pass. It is not the easiest pass through the mountains. There are several others, but it is the only pass that connects the high northern valleys, where a small number of mining and herding communities have lived for many centuries, to the lowland country where the larger towns of the kingdom are. The other passes lead in other directions. The other passes serve other purposes. Eldhollow Pass, narrow and difficult and high, is the pass that has, for as long as anyone can remember, carried the small, persistent traffic of trade and family connection between the high country and the low. The pass is, by its nature, dangerous. The path through it climbs steeply for many miles. The ground underfoot is rough and frequently icy, even in summer. The cliffs on either side of the path rise to heights that make the pass, in certain places, more like a deep stone gallery than an open passage. The wind, when the wind blows, channels through the pass with a force that can knock an unsteady traveler off the path entirely. The weather changes quickly. A clear morning can become, by mid-afternoon, a snowstorm that will not end until the following dawn. These are the ordinary dangers of high mountain country. Travelers who use Eldhollow Pass in daylight, in good weather, with appropriate equipment, manage these dangers in the way that experienced mountain travelers have always managed them. They prepare. They watch the weather. They walk carefully. They reach the other side. But Eldhollow Pass also has a different kind of danger, one that the experienced travelers of the lower country have learned to take seriously, and that the records of the kingdom have, since their earliest entries, treated as a particular feature of the pass, requiring particular attention. The pass is not safe at night. The not safe at night, in the case of Eldhollow Pass, is not simply the not safe at night that any high mountain country is at night. There is something else. Something that the people of the high country and the low country have always known about, in the careful way that small communities know about the dangers of their landscapes, and that has shaped the way the pass has been used for as long as the pass has been used. The pass, after dark, contains things that should not be encountered. What the things are, the records of the kingdom do not specify. The records simply note, in their various entries across the centuries, that travelers who attempt to cross Eldhollow Pass after sunset and before dawn have, in many cases, not arrived at the other side. The records note that the bodies of these travelers have, in some cases, been recovered. In other cases, no trace of them has ever been found. The records note that the survivors of partial encounters, those who turned back before reaching the center of the pass, have, in some cases, returned to their communities in conditions that the local authorities have preferred not to describe in writing. The records note, with the careful imprecision that medieval and early modern records sometimes use for such matters, that there are presences in the pass at night that are not present during the day, and that these presences have been observed by the few witnesses who have survived close encounters with them, to be presences of a kind that do not have any clear analogue in the catalogue of natural creatures. For these reasons, the people of the kingdom have, since before the records began, organized the use of Eldhollow Pass around a single firm rule. The pass is to be used only in daylight. Travelers who arrive at the pass too late in the day to complete the crossing before sunset are to wait at one of the small inns that have been established at both the upper and lower ends of the pass, until the next morning. Travellers who, for any reason, find themselves caught in the pass after the light has begun to fail are to take shelter in one of the small stone refuges that have been built along the path, close their doors against the night, and remain inside until dawn. The rule has worked, with the broad reliability of rules that have been tested by many generations of practical use, for the entire history of the pass. Most travellers who use the pass arrive at their destinations safely. The occasional disappearances and partial encounters have remained over the centuries occasional. The pass has continued to function as a useful but carefully managed feature of the kingdom's geography. The pass has also, throughout this same history, had a keeper. The keeper is, at any given time, one person. The person walks the pass at the boundary hours of dawn and dusk. The person attends to the lanterns that have been mounted at intervals along the path, since some ancient period that the records of the kingdom do not precisely identify. The lanterns are large iron structures, taller than a man and wide enough that the wicks inside them can produce, when lit, a light that is visible from a great distance even in the worst weather. There are 47 of them along the length of the pass. They are mounted on stone plinths that have been built at carefully chosen locations, generally at the bends in the path or at the entrances to the small refuges, so that a traveller in any part of the pass can see at least one lantern from any position. The keeper lights the lanterns every evening before the sun has fully set. The keeper extinguishes the lanterns every morning after the sun has fully risen. The work takes, by the careful pacing of an experienced keeper, approximately 3 hours in the evening and 3 hours in the morning. The keeper begins at one end of the pass and works toward the other, lighting or extinguishing each lantern in turn. The work is, in its visible features, a simple practical task. The keeper carries a small lamp for the lighting. The keeper carries a small extinguishing tool, a kind of long-handled cap, for the extinguishing. The keeper walks. The keeper attends to each lantern. The keeper continues to the next. The lighting and the extinguishing are not, however, in any sense that the people of the kingdom have ever considered the matter, the actual purpose of the keeper's work. The actual purpose of the keeper's work is something else. This is the story of one of those keepers, a young man named Aron Caldyn, who became the keeper of Eldhollow Pass in the autumn of his 23rd year, after the death of his father, who had been the keeper for the previous 41 years. The story of how Aron came to inherit the work, how he learned what the work actually was, and what the work cost him in the long years of his own keeping, is a story that the records of the kingdom have not, in any of their entries, written down. It is a story that, until now, has been preserved only in the oral traditions of a small number of families in the high country who have, across many generations, taken on the role of the keeper. To begin Aron Caldyn's story, you have to begin in the small village of Brackenwell, which sits at the lower end of Eldhollow Pass. Brackenwell is a small village built where the path that becomes the pass first begins to climb away from the lowland country. It is a village of perhaps 60 households. It has a small inn for travellers, a small church for the local population, a smithy, and a few small workshops that produce the goods the village needs for its own use. The village's primary economic function, beyond its own self-sufficiency, is to serve as the lower base for the small trade that moves through the pass. The inn caters to travellers waiting for daylight to make their crossing. The smithy occasionally repairs the equipment that travellers need for the high country. The villagers themselves, when they are not engaged in their own trades, sometimes work as guides or porters for travellers who require assistance. The Caldyn family had lived in Brackenwell for many generations. They had been, in their public identity in the village, a family of small farmers. They held a few acres of land at the edge of the village, on which they grew vegetables and kept a small number of sheep. They were respected, but not prominent, members of the village community. They were the kind of family that, in the small social hierarchies of villages of that size, occupied the comfortable middle ground between the most established families and the more recent arrivals. What the village did not, in any visible sense, know about the Caldyn family was that the Caldyns had been, for at least 7 generations, and perhaps longer, the keepers of Eldhollow Pass. The keeping was conducted in private. The keeper of the pass, in the long history of the role, had always been a member of one specific family, and that family had always been the Caldyns. The work was passed from father to son, generation after generation. Each generation contained, in its eldest male child, the next keeper. The eldest male child was prepared, over the course of his youth and early adulthood, for the role he would eventually take on. The preparation was conducted privately, between the current keeper and his successor. The other members of the family, including the younger children and the wives of the keepers, were not, in the strict sense, told the full nature of the work. They were told only enough to allow them to support the keeper in his daily life. They knew that the eldest son of each generation walked the pass at dawn and dusk to attend to the lanterns. They knew that the work was important. They did not know, in any detail, why. The keepers themselves had agreed, in the long, unbroken tradition of the role, to maintain this privacy. The reasons for the privacy were several. The first reason was practical. The role of the keeper required, for its proper performance, that the keeper not be the subject of village gossip or village curiosity. The keeper had to be able to walk the pass at dawn and dusk without attracting attention. The villagers had to allow the keeper to do his work without asking questions about it. The privacy was, in this sense, simply the operational requirement of a role that the village preferred not to think about too directly. The second reason was more complicated. The work the keeper did was, the keepers had concluded over many generations, work that the villagers would not benefit from understanding. The understanding would change the way the villagers thought about the pass. It would change the way they thought about the high country beyond the pass. It would change the way they thought about the safety of the world they lived in. The keepers had concluded that the villagers' practical safety did not require the understanding, and that the understanding itself would be a kind of harm to the villagers' ordinary peace of mind. So the keepers, generation after generation, had simply not explained. Aron Caldyn had grown up in this family arrangement without, for most of his early life, fully understanding it. He had known from a very young age that his father walked the pass at dawn and dusk. He had been told by his father that the work involved attending to the lanterns. He had understood, by the time he was perhaps 8 or 9, that the lanterns were considered important by the various authorities of the kingdom, and that his father's role in maintaining them was a role of some significance. But he had not, in his childhood, asked many questions about the specific details of the work. The work had simply been, in the way that the work of one's parents always is in childhood, a feature of the family's life. His father went out before dawn and before dusk. His father returned several hours later. The family did the things that families do. His father had begun to take Aron with him on the dawn and dusk walks when Aron was 12 years old. The taking, at first, had been occasional. His father had explained that he wanted Aron to begin learning the path, in case Aron should ever need to assist him with the work. The walks, at this stage, had been simple. They had walked the pass together. His father had pointed out the locations of the lanterns. His father had demonstrated the lighting and the extinguishing. Aron had observed, but the walks, as Aron had grown older, had become more frequent and more substantive. By the time Aron was 15, he was walking the pass with his father every other day. By the time he was 18, he was walking the pass with his father most days. He was, in his later teenage years, increasingly performing the actual work of the lighting and the extinguishing while his father walked with him as a supervisor. It was during these years that Aron began to understand that his father's work was not, in the strict sense, the work of a man who simply lit and extinguished 47 lanterns. There was something else his father was doing during the walks. There was a particular attention his father paid to the surroundings as they walked. There was a particular way his father moved. There were small adjustments his father made at certain points along the path that did not have any obvious connection to the lanterns themselves. When Aron began to ask about these things, in his late teens, his father had begun to give him answers that were partial, careful, and strange. His father had said, in one early conversation, that the lanterns were not lit and extinguished only for the benefit of the travelers who used the pass during the day. The lanterns, his father had said, served other purposes as well. The keeper, his father had said, was attending not only to the practical lighting of the path, but to other concerns that the keeper would understand more fully when the keeper had become the full keeper. His father had said, in another conversation, that the work of the keeper was more important than the work of an ordinary lantern lighter. The work, his father had said, was one of the small unrecognized roles by which the larger life of the kingdom was made possible. The keeper served, in some way that his father did not yet want to specify, a function that went beyond the particular practical safety of any particular traveler. His father had said, finally, in a conversation that Aron would think about, in the years that followed, more often than any other conversation he had with his father, that the work of the keeper was work that would change the keeper. The work would, over the long years of its practice, alter the keeper in ways the keeper would not, when he first took on the role, fully anticipate. The keeper, his father had said, was not the same kind of person at the end of his keeping as he was at the beginning. The work changed the keeper. The keeper became, over the course of his keeping, something that the keeper would not, in his early life, have recognized as a possible version of himself. Aron had asked his father, when his father had said this, whether the change was a change for the better or for the worse. His father had been silent for a long time after the question. He had walked, in the silence, perhaps 50 paces of the path. He had not, in those paces, looked at Aron. He had said, finally, that the change was neither for the better nor for the worse. The change was simply a different kind of person from the person the keeper had been. The keeper, at the end of his keeping, was a person who had spent many years doing a particular kind of work in a particular kind of place. That work, in that place, produced a person of a particular kind. The kind of person was not, in the ordinary categories of human evaluation, easy to categorize as good or bad. The kind of person was simply a kind of person. The kind of person who had been the keeper. His father had said also that he hoped Aron would understand, when the time came for Aron to become the keeper himself, that the choice of becoming the keeper was a real choice. Aron would not be required, his father had said, to take on the role. The Caldyn family had, in the long history of the keeping, never compelled any son to inherit the work who did not want to inherit it. There had been, his father had said, a small number of generations in the family's history when the eldest son had declined the role, and a younger son or another relative had been chosen instead. The work had continued. The family had continued. The choice had been respected. But his father had said there had not been, in the recorded history of the family, any generation in which no one had taken on the role at all. The work had always been continued by someone in the family, even when the eldest son had not wanted to be the one. The work was that important. Aron had listened to his father say these things, in the slow walking of the pass at dawn or dusk, in the small precious quiet of the conversations between a father and a son who were preparing for the eventual transfer of a long inherited duty. He had not, at the time of these conversations, fully understood what his father was telling him. He would, in the autumn of his 23rd year, when his father died, and the work passed to him, begin to understand. Aron's father, whose name was Aron Caldyn, died in the early autumn of the year that Aron was 23 years old. The death came suddenly. Aron had been, for the previous several years, a man in robust middle age. He had been 62 years old at the time of his death. He had been walking the pass twice a day every day for 41 years. He had not been, in any visible respect, in declining health. The death itself, when it came in the way that deaths in mountain country sometimes come. He had been walking back from his dusk liding on a clear evening in early September when his heart had simply stopped. His body had been found by Aron and several of the men of the village the following morning on the path approximately a quarter of a mile from the lower entrance of the pass. There had been no apparent cause beyond the failure of his heart. The local healer who examined the body confirmed what was already evident, that Aron Caldyn had died of natural causes that, in the absence of any deeper investigation, would have to be called the simple ending of a life that had reached its allotted span. The funeral was held 3 days later in the small church at the center of Brackenwell. The entire village attended. The village small council gave the formal speeches. The local priest conducted the rites. Aron Caldyn was buried in the village graveyard beside the graves of his own father and his grandfather, who had been the previous keepers of the pass before him. Aron stood at the graveside with his mother and his 2 younger sisters. He listened to the speeches. He participated in the rituals. He accepted the condolences of the villagers as they passed by. He did not, during the funeral or during the days surrounding it, allow himself to think directly about what was now waiting for him. He had known, of course, since his early teens, that this day would come. He had been preparing for it. He had been, in some sense, the keeper in training for nearly 11 years. He had walked the pass with his father hundreds of times. He had performed the lighting and the extinguishing on most of those walks. He was, in any practical sense, ready to take on the work. But he had not, until the actual moment of his father's death, fully grasped what taking on the work would mean. He had been, throughout his preparation, the apprentice. He had been the one who walked beside the keeper. He had been the one who learned. He had not been, in any moment of his training, the one whose presence in the pass was the principal protective presence. He would be that now. The lanterns had been lit on the evening of his father's death by one of the older men of the village. The man had known, in the general way the village knew about Bren's role, that someone needed to light the lanterns that night. He had walked the path himself with a borrowed lamp and had attended to the lanterns in what had to be acknowledged as a brave but inadequate substitute for the careful keeping his father had performed. The man had, by his own later account, been frightened on the walk in a way he had not previously been frightened in his life. He had felt, He told the village in the days that followed that there was something in the pass watching him. He had completed the work. He had not, in the days following, ever expressed any willingness to undertake the work again. The lanterns had been extinguished on the morning after the funeral by Aron. This was Aron's first walk as the actual keeper. He walked the pass alone, in the cold blue light of an early autumn morning, and he extinguished each of the 47 lanterns in turn. He did the work in the careful order his father had taught him. He attended, as his father had taught him to attend, to the small particular features of each lantern that his father had taught him to attend to. He returned to the village in the late morning, in the bright sunlight of the rising day, with the work completed. He had felt, throughout the morning's walk, no particular sense of presence in the pass. The morning extinguishing, he understood from his years of training, was in some sense a less significant version of the keeper's work than the evening lighting. The morning was the period of the keeper's safe practice. The dangers of the pass receded with the dawn. The keeper in the morning was simply finishing the work that the night had required. The evening lighting the same day would be different. Aron began the evening lighting that day, perhaps an hour and a half before the sun was scheduled to set. He walked from the village up the lower portion of the path to the first lantern, which stood on a stone plinth approximately a quarter of a mile from the village's last building. He carried, in a small bag over his shoulder, the lighting tools and a flask of the special oil that the lanterns burned. He carried in his hand the small lamp from which the lanterns would be lit. He arrived at the first lantern. He performed the lighting in the careful sequence his father had taught him. The wick caught. The flame grew. The lantern began to produce the steady, tall light that would, in the hours of the night to come, illuminate this particular section of the path. He moved to the second lantern. He performed the lighting again. He moved to the third. The work, in its physical particulars, was exactly what he had performed many times in training. The lanterns lit. The flames grew. The path behind him was filling with the regular intervals of light that the keeper's work produced. But Aron began, somewhere around the lighting of the 7th or 8th lantern, to feel a difference in the pass that he had not felt during his training walks. The difference was not a single thing he could clearly identify. It was a kind of accumulating awareness. The pass was, in some way that was not entirely explicable in physical terms, paying attention to him. He had felt this, occasionally, during the latter years of his training, when he had been walking with his father. He had asked his father about it once. His father had said, in his careful way, that this was one of the things the keeper would come to know more directly when the keeper became the keeper. The pass paid attention to the keeper. The pass had been, his father had said, paying attention to the keepers for as long as there had been keepers. The attention was not, in itself, threatening. It was simply the awareness of a place that knew when its keeper was present. Aron continued the lighting in the deepening blue of the late afternoon. He reached the 10th lantern, the 15th, the 20th, the 25th. He arrived, somewhere around the 27th or 28th lantern, at the central section of the pass. The central section was, his father had taught him, the most important section of the pass for the keeper's work. The lanterns of the central section were spaced more closely than the lanterns of the outer sections. The path through the central section was narrower. The cliffs on either side of the path rose to their highest points. The wind in the central section was at its strongest. The light, by the time Aron reached the central section, was beginning to fail in earnest. The sun had dropped behind the western ridge. The pass was filling with the cool blue-gray of high mountain dusk. Aron lit the central lanterns in the deepening shadow. It was at the 33rd lantern that he saw, for the first time, what walked in the pass at night. He saw it as he was lighting the lantern. He had been, in the careful way his father had taught him, focused on the work of the lighting itself. He had been attending to the wick. He had been attending to the lamp he was using. He had been attending to the small adjustments to the wick that the lighting required. He had not been in those moments of focused work, looking at the surroundings of the lantern. Something moved in the corner of his vision on the far side of the pass. He turned slowly in the direction of the movement. He could not, in the dim light of the late dusk, see clearly what had moved. He could see, in the deeper shadow against the eastern cliff, a shape that was the wrong shape for any of the rocks or the small bushes that grew at the cliff's base. The shape was tall. The shape was not, in any of its proportions, the shape of a deer or a goat, or any of the larger animals that occasionally entered the pass. The shape was, by the way it stood, more like the shape of a person than the shape of an animal. But it was not, in the proportions of its head and its limbs, the shape of any person Aron had ever seen. The shape was looking at him. Aron understood this, in the moment of his first turning, with the immediate certainty that the shape's awareness of him was greater than his awareness of it. The shape had, presumably, been watching him for some considerable time before he had turned. The shape had moved in the corner of his vision, perhaps deliberately, perhaps to bring itself into the range of his peripheral vision, so that he would, eventually, notice it. The shape was, in the moment Aron saw it, allowing itself to be seen. Aron stood at the 33rd lantern, with his small lamp in his hand and his lighting tool in his other hand, and he did not move. He had been told, in his training, what to do if this happened. His father had told him, in one of the conversations of his late teenage years, that the keeper of the pass would, eventually, see things in the pass that the keeper had not seen before. The seeing would happen, his father had said, in the keeper's first weeks or months of independent service. The keeper would, after his apprenticeship had ended, and after he had begun to walk the pass alone, encounter the presences that the lanterns were lit to manage. The presences, his father had said, were not, in the strict sense, malevolent. They did not, ordinarily, attack the keeper. They were not, in the strict sense, even hostile to him. They were, in some way that was difficult to describe in human language, simply other. They lived in the pass. They had lived in the pass for as long as the pass had existed. They were, in the same way that animals are not, in the strict sense, malevolent toward the gardeners who tend the gardens that the animals have been displaced from, simply present in a place that humans had also begun to use. What the lanterns did, his father had explained, was establish a boundary. The presences of the pass were able to share the pass with humans during daylight, when the humans were active and the presences were not. After dark, when the humans were ordinarily not active, the presences were the dominant inhabitants of the pass. The lanterns, by their presence and their light, marked a particular kind of agreement. The path through the pass, marked by the lanterns, was understood by both the humans and the presences to be a path that humans could use, with appropriate care, even after dark. The path off the lanterns was understood to be the territory of the presences. The travelers who stayed on the path, even at night, were not, in the practical experience of the pass's long history, ordinarily harmed. The travelers who left the path, for any reason, including the reason that they had become disoriented and could not find the path, were the travelers who, in the long records of the pass, ended up missing or partial. The keeper, his father had said, was the human party to the agreement. The keeper's presence in the pass at the boundary hours of dawn and dusk was the means by which the agreement was renewed each day. The lighting of the lanterns was the visible signal that the agreement was in effect. The extinguishing of the lanterns in the morning was the visible signal that the day had returned. The presences, his father had said, would acknowledge the keeper when the keeper became the keeper. They would, in the weeks or months of the keeper's first independent service, allow themselves to be seen. They would, in the visible form of being seen, communicate to the keeper that they understood that the keeper had taken on the role and that the agreement was continuing. The keeper, when this happened, was to do nothing. The keeper was to continue the work. The keeper was to allow the seeing to occur, without acknowledging it in any visible way, without attempting to communicate with the presences, without departing from the careful sequence of the lighting. The presences would, when they had completed their seeing, withdraw. The keeper would continue to the next lantern. The work would proceed. This, Aron understood, was what was happening at the 33rd lantern. The shape on the far side of the pass was looking at him. Aron, by his father's instruction, did not look back at it directly for more than the brief moment of his first turning. He turned, slowly, back to the lantern he had been lighting. He completed the small adjustments to the wick that the lighting required. He stepped back from the lantern. He shouldered his bag. He moved to the path. He continued to the 34th lantern. He did not, in the moments of his moving on, look back at the shape on the far side of the pass. He did not need to. He understood, in the awareness that the pass had given him, that the shape had begun to withdraw the moment he had begun to move. By the time he reached the 34th lantern, the shape was no longer there. The pass, on the far side, was the empty pass that the eyes saw in the deepening dusk. He lit the 34th lantern. He lit the 35th. He lit the 36th. He continued, in the slow, careful pace of an experienced keeper, through the remaining lanterns of the central section and into the upper section, where the path began to descend toward the small inn at the upper end of the pass. He saw, at 3 more points along the remaining path, additional shapes in the deeper shadows. Each shape was different from the previous ones. One was much smaller, perhaps the size of a young child, but in proportions that were not the proportions of any child. One was very tall, perhaps 3 times the height of a man, and seemed to consist mostly of a kind of vertical absence rather than any solid form. One was, in some way that Aron could not have described, the most ordinary looking of the 4, almost the shape of a man, but standing in a posture that suggested it was waiting for something Aron could not see. In each case, Aron did not acknowledge the shape. He continued his work. He completed the lighting of each lantern. He moved on. He arrived at the 47th lantern, the final lantern of the pass, just as the last grey light of the dusk was leaving the western sky. He performed the lighting. He shouldered his bag. He turned. He began the long walk back through the now fully illuminated pass to the village. The walk back at night was different from the walk back at dawn. The pass at night, even with the lanterns lit, was a different place from the pass at dawn or in daylight. The shadows between the lanterns were deep. The wind sometimes moved the lantern flames in ways that made the shadows shift. The whole atmosphere of the pass, even on the lit path, was the atmosphere of a place that was, in its larger reality, the territory of the presences rather than the territory of humans. Aron walked the lit path, in the careful steady pace his father had taught him. He did not, in his return walk, see any further shapes. The presences his father had taught him had completed their acknowledgement of the new keeper at the rate of 1 shape per major section of the pass. They did not, in any of the records of the keepers, present further shapes during the keeper's first night. He returned to the village just before midnight. His mother was awake when he entered the house. She had a small fire burning in the kitchen. She had a meal prepared on the table. She did not, when he came in, ask him about the walk. She simply set the meal in front of him. She poured him a cup of strong, dark tea. She sat with him while he ate. When he had finished eating, she said only, in the soft, careful voice his mother used when she was speaking about things she did not have full knowledge of, that he was now the keeper. She said that his father had been, in his life, a good keeper. She said that she trusted Aron would also be a good keeper. She said that she would help him in whatever ways the wife and mother of a keeper could help, for as long as she remained in the world. Aron thanked her. He said that he was tired. He said that he would go to bed. He did not tell her, that night or in any of the nights that followed, what he had seen on the path. The keepers, his father had told him, did not share these specific experiences with their families. The families knew, in the general way, what the work was. The families did not know in the specific way what the keepers saw in the doing of it. This was one of the small structural separations of the keeper's life, his father had said. The keeper carried in private the specific knowledge that the work produced. The family carried the keeper in love and in support without needing to carry that specific knowledge themselves. Aron went to his room. He undressed. He got into his bed. He lay awake for some considerable time, thinking about what he had seen. He did not, in those first hours of his keeping, feel afraid. He felt instead the strange, clear quietness that the witnessing of profound things sometimes produces. He had been told by his father what to expect. He had seen, on his first night, exactly what his father had told him he would see. The work, in this sense, was proceeding as the long tradition of the keepers had always told the new keepers it would proceed. He slept, eventually, in the way a young man sleeps after a day that has changed the shape of the rest of his life. The sleep was not entirely restful. He dreamed, in the deeper hours, of shapes in the deepening shadow of an old past that had been, before he was born and would be after he was gone, the territory of things he was now the only person responsible for sharing it with. In the years that followed Aron's first night as the keeper of Eldhollow Pass, he settled, in the slow way that human beings settle into long inherited duties, into the rhythm of the work. The rhythm was, in its visible particulars, simple: 2 walks a day, the lighting at dusk, the extinguishing at dawn, the small accumulating maintenance of the lanterns themselves, which required, periodically, the replacement of wicks, the cleaning of the iron structures, the refilling of the oil reservoirs, the careful storage of the materials the lanterns required, the arrangements with the small group of merchants in the village who provided the oil and the wicks and the other supplies. Aron performed all of this work, in the years from the autumn of his 23rd year forward, with the patient, careful attention his father had taught him to bring to it. He continued also the small farming work of the family, the sheep, the vegetable garden, the few acres of land. The work was, in its visible appearance to the village, the principal occupation of the Caldyn household. The lighting of the lanterns continued to be, in the village's understanding, the small unusual feature of the family that no one discussed in detail. Aron's mother, Marjorie Caldyn, continued to live with him in the family house for the first several years of his keeping. She had, in her widowhood, found a kind of stability in the ongoing rhythm of the household. She managed the kitchen. She maintained the garden in the days when Aron was occupied with the lanterns. She continued, in the way that mothers of adult sons sometimes continue, to provide the small daily care that allowed Aron to focus on the work that was, in some sense, larger than the household it took place within. His 2 younger sisters had, by the time of his father's death, both been near the age of marriage. The elder, Ira, had married a young farmer from a neighboring village in the year following her father's death. The younger, Anwen, had married a small merchant from the lowland country 3 years after her father's death. Both had moved away from Brackenwell to their new households. Both had visited their mother and brother periodically in the years that followed. Neither, by the careful arrangement of the family, had ever asked Aron in any direct way about the specific details of the lantern work. Marjorie Caldyn herself died in the 7th year of Aron's keeping, of natural causes that, in the assessment of the local healer, were the simple ending of a life that had reached its allotted span. She was 67 years old at the time of her death. She was buried in the village graveyard beside her husband. Aron, after his mother's death, lived in the family house alone. He continued, in the long decades that followed, to walk the pass twice a day. He continued to light the lanterns at dusk and to extinguish them at dawn. He continued, in his daily life, to be the visible figure of a small farmer of Brackenwell, with the small, unusual additional duty that the village preferred not to examine in any detail. The keeping changed him, in the way his father had told him the keeping would change him. The change was slow. It happened, in the long years of the keeping, in small accumulating ways that Aron himself, in any single year, could not have clearly identified. He noticed it, sometimes, in his interactions with the other villagers. He noticed it in the small ways his thinking moved, in moments of ordinary daily life. He noticed it most clearly in the slow accumulating sense that the world he lived in was, in some way that he had not understood when he was a younger man, larger than the world the other villagers seemed to live in. The other villagers, Aron came to understand, lived in a world that the lanterns of Eldhollow Pass had been keeping safe for them. They did not, in their daily lives, encounter the presences that the keeper encountered in the dusk. They did not, in their daily lives, walk the path that ran between the territory of humans and the territory of something else. They lived, in their useful and ordinary way, in the part of the world that the keeper's work had cordoned off as the part where ordinary human life could safely take place. Aron, by his work, lived in a slightly different part of the world. He lived in some sense that his father had not been able to explain to him in his training, but that became, slowly, clear to him in the doing of the work, on the boundary between the two parts. He was the human party to the agreement that allowed the two parts to coexist. He was the witness, on behalf of his community, of the larger reality that his community was being protected from knowing about. This kind of life was, Aron came to understand in the long years of his keeping, both heavier and lighter than the life of the ordinary villagers. It was heavier because the knowledge it required was knowledge that the ordinary villagers did not have to carry. It was lighter because, in some sense, the knowledge itself was a kind of gift. The keeper, in his keeping, knew things about the world that the world's other inhabitants did not know. The knowing was, in the long perspective of a keeping life, a kind of strange privilege. Aron continued to walk the pass for 47 years. He walked it through his 30s. He walked it through his 40s. He walked it through his 50s. He walked it through his early 60s. In all of those years, he saw, periodically, the presences of the pass. He did not, in the careful tradition his father had taught him, ever acknowledge them. He did not, in the careful tradition, ever attempt to understand them more fully than the work required. He simply continued to do the work. He continued to light the lanterns at dusk and to extinguish them at dawn. He continued to be the human party to the agreement. He never married. This was, in some way, the principal personal cost of his keeping. He had, in his early adult years, occasionally considered the possibility of marriage. There had been, in his late 20s, a young woman of the village whom he had been fond of and who, he believed, had been fond of him. The relationship had not progressed. Aron had, in retrospect, understood that it had not progressed in significant part because he had not been able to imagine how he could have, in the same household, both a wife and the work that the keeping required. The work required, by its nature, that the keeper sleep alone in a particular bedroom from which the keeper could leave at the appropriate hours without disturbing anyone else's rest. The work required, by its nature, that the keeper not have, in the household, a partner who would be expecting the kind of daily intimacy that ordinary marriages required. The work was, in its particular shape, more compatible with a solitary household than with the shared one of an ordinary marriage. The previous keepers, Aron had eventually realized, had managed this differently. His own father and his father before him had married and had families. They had, by some arrangement of household life that Aron had not, in his own life, found a way to replicate, made the work compatible with a marriage. Aron had not been able to do this. He was not, by his temperament, the kind of man who could maintain the kind of structured household life that the previous keepers had maintained. He lived, therefore, alone. He had occasional companions in his life. He had a small group of friends in the village, most of them men of his own approximate age, with whom he shared the quiet evenings of the days when his work allowed it. He had, for a long period, a particular friendship with the local priest of the village, a thoughtful man named Father Robin, who had become curious, in his own way, about the work Aron did, and who had, in long evenings of careful conversation, slowly come to understand more about it than Aron had been entirely comfortable with him understanding. The friendship had been one of the deeper relationships of Aron's adult life. Father Robin had died, of natural causes, when Aron was 54. Aron had felt the death deeply, but the principal feature of Aron's life, in the long decades of his keeping, was the work itself. The work, eventually, produced its successor. Aron found his successor in the autumn of his 67th year, in the second cousin of his eldest sister Ira. Ira, by that year, was an old woman herself, in her late 60s, living in the neighboring village where she had moved as a young bride. Her husband had died several years earlier. She had, in her widowhood, been visiting Brackenwell more frequently than she had visited it during her marriage. She had been bringing, on some of these visits, her grandchildren and the various children of her extended family. Among the children she had brought, in the autumn of Aron's 67th year, was a young boy named Caldyn. Caldyn was 11 years old. He was the son of Ira's daughter and the daughter's husband, and was, by the genealogical careful reckoning that the keeping families had always maintained, a Caldyn descendant by the maternal line. Aron noticed something about Caldyn, when Ira brought him for the visit, that he had not noticed about any of the other children of the extended family. Caldyn asked questions. Caldyn asked the kinds of questions that Aron himself, when he had been Caldyn's age, had asked his own father. Caldyn asked about the lanterns. He asked about the pass. He asked about the work. He asked in particular about the parts of the work that the village understood least well. He asked these questions with the careful, patient attention of a child who was not, in the asking, simply curious. He was, in the asking, attempting to understand. Aron answered Caldyn's questions, in the autumn of that visit, more directly than he had ever answered the questions of any child of the extended family. He told Caldyn the things his own father had told him at the same age. He showed Caldyn, in a brief afternoon visit to the lower portion of the path, where the lanterns were and how they were structured. Caldyn listened. Caldyn did not, in the brief visit, ask any of the deeper questions that, Aron knew, would eventually become important, but Caldyn listened in the way that the future keepers listened. Ira returned to her village with Caldyn after that visit. Aron continued his work. In the years that followed, Aron arranged with Ira and with Caldyn's parents for Caldyn to come for longer visits to Brackenwell. The visits were, on their visible surface, the ordinary visits of a great-nephew to his great-uncle. Caldyn helped with the small farming work. Caldyn stayed in the spare bedroom of the family house. Caldyn returned to his parents at the end of each visit. But the visits were also, in their actual function, the early stages of Caldyn's training. Aron began, in the visits when Caldyn was 12 and 13 and 14, to take him on the dawn-extinguishing walks. He began, in the visits when Caldyn was 15 and 16, to take him on some of the dusk-lighting walks. He began, in the visits when Caldyn was 17 and 18, to discuss with him, in the careful, gradual way Aron's own father had used, the deeper meaning of the work. Caldyn accepted the work with the kind of quiet seriousness that Aron remembered from his own acceptance of it many decades earlier. Caldyn was 21 years old when Aron, who was then 72, formally proposed that Caldyn should consider becoming the next keeper. Aron had, by that year, begun to feel, in the small accumulating ways that very old keepers feel such things, that his time was approaching. He was, in any reasonable reading of his health, still capable of the work. But he had begun to consider, with increasing seriousness, the question of when the work should be transferred. He had concluded, after long consideration, that he wanted to transfer the work while he was still capable of providing Caldyn with several full years of supervised practice. Caldyn accepted the proposal. He moved, in the autumn of Aron's 72nd year, to Brackenwell. He moved into the spare bedroom of the family house. He began the formal training that would, over the following several years, prepare him to take on the work alone. The training continued for 4 years. By the autumn of Aron's 76th year, when Caldyn was 25, Aron had concluded that Caldyn was ready. Aron had transferred, by that autumn, the active work of the keeping to Caldyn. Caldyn walked the pass twice a day. Caldyn lit the lanterns. Caldyn extinguished them. Aron remained at the family house, in the small adjustments of late old age, available for consultation, but no longer participating directly in the work. Aron lived for 3 more years after the formal transfer. He died in the spring of his 79th year, in the same bedroom where his own father had died 47 years earlier. The death was, in the assessment of the local healer, the natural ending of a long life that had been, in its small daily particulars, more demanding than the lives of most of the men of the village. He was buried in the village graveyard, beside his father and his mother and his grandfather. Caldyn continued the work for the next 44 years. Caldyn had 3 children of his own. The eldest of his sons, in the careful tradition of the keeping families, took on the work after Caldyn's death. The keeping continued, generation after generation, in the long, unbroken way that the keeping had continued since before the records of the kingdom began. The lanterns of Eldhollow Pass continued to be lit every evening before the sun had fully set. The lanterns continued to be extinguished every morning after the sun had fully risen. The presences of the pass continued, in their slow, patient way, to acknowledge each new keeper as the keeping was transferred. The travellers of the pass continued, in the long centuries of human ordinary life, that the keeping protected, to use the path during the day, to take shelter in the inns at the boundary hours, to occasionally use the small stone refuges along the path when the weather caught them out. and with the broad reliability of the careful agreement the keeping maintained, to arrive at the other side. Most of the travellers, throughout these centuries, never knew that the lanterns were anything more than practical safety lights for the pass. Most of them assumed that the lighting was conducted by some local authority for the practical reason of preventing accidents. Most of them did not, in any moment of their crossing, recognize that they were walking through a territory whose continued usability for humans was the result of a particular agreement, maintained by particular families across particular long centuries. This was, in the slow accumulating wisdom of the keeping families, the proper state of the matter. The traveller's ignorance of the work was, in some sense, the work's success. The work was successful when the travellers could continue, generation after generation, to think of the pass as simply a useful if difficult feature of the kingdom's geography. The work was successful when the travellers did not have to know, in the practical conduct of their lives, what the keeping was actually for. Somewhere in the high mountain country of an old kingdom, in a small village called Brackenwell at the lower end of a particular pass, the keeping presumably continues. The lanterns presumably continue to be lit at dusk and extinguished at dawn. The presences of the pass presumably continue, in their slow, patient way, to share the territory with the humans who use it during the day. The keepers, generation after generation, presumably continue to walk the path at the boundary hours, to perform the small particular work that the agreement requires, and to carry, in their private knowledge, the specific information about the larger reality that the agreement protects their communities from having to know about. The work is, in its particular shape, the work of a small number of people across the centuries who have agreed to know what others do not need to know. The work is, in its particular shape, the work of standing on the boundary on behalf of those who do not stand there. May the keepers continue to find the strength to do the work. May the agreements continue to hold. May the travellers continue to arrive at the other side in the long, patient way they have been arriving, generation after generation, for as long as there has been a kingdom that needs them to arrive. Good night.